Our scripture that Beth read earlier during the service is on the heels of the story of Zacchaeus. We know the story of Zacchaeus. Yes, he was a wee little man. The wee little man was he. But the more to Zacchaeus than just that. He was a tax collector. And tax collectors in Jesus' day were basically the scum of the earth. And no one really said anything good about a tax collector and what they did, because they had a reputation of cheating people out of their hard-earned money. But after being confronted with Jesus and all that he stood for and believed in, Zacchaeus had a change of heart. And he did not want to continue being who he was or continue doing what he has been doing. So he decides that in order to pour out his whole self into following Jesus, there needed to be a radical change in his life. And not only did he decide that he needed to participate in a radical change in the way that he was living, but he chose to actually change. Now, we all know there's a difference between deciding that you need to make a change, an improvement in your life, and actually changing, actually improving. This radical change that Zacchaeus decides to make is to give half of his possessions to the poor, and on top of that, if he has ever cheated anyone, then he'll repay them back 4 times the debt. And that's a pretty radical change from someone whom you would not expect. On the other end of our scripture, we have the traditional Palm Sunday scripture where Jesus enters triumphantly into Jerusalem on a colt and is greeted by a cheering crowd that is willing to throw down their cloaks in order to adorn the path that is set before him. Since we know where the scripture is located in Luke's wider story, we know that in our scripture there's a sense of urgency in what Jesus is doing and saying, because Jesus' time on earth is coming to an end very soon, actually. Jesus wants his last words to be memorable for those around him, and he wants to encourage them so that they will hold strong and remain consistent in carrying on the gospel message. We also know that through this parable, Jesus is trying to convey that in order to follow him, radical steps need to be made in one's life. There's no room to be comfortable or passive when it comes to following Jesus. Becoming a disciple has nothing to do with any of that. In fact, being a disciple involves the exact opposite of comfortableness and passivity. During the time that Jesus tells this parable in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus knows that it is the beginning of the end for him. And those around him have a sense, they have a feeling that Jesus' time in the world is coming to a close. They aren't quite sure what it's going to look like, how it's going to go down, and when the end will come for Jesus. Jesus is entering into this last phase of his life, and the events in that last phase will most certainly cost him his life. But as we know, Jesus' death was not the end, because resurrection came. And that same kind of resurrection is ours to live into, to breathe in, and to observe today. The parable of the talents or servants is similar to the parable of the talents that we find in the 25th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. In our scripture in Luke, there is a nobleman who is going to leave his home and his slaves in order to receive a special acknowledgement from a king. But before he leaves, he gives 10 of his slaves 10 pounds each, and he tells them to put good use to them until he gets back. And with that, the nobleman leaves. Now the people of the country hated this nobleman, so they didn't want his slaves to do anything with the money that might benefit their master. Now when the nobleman came back, he summoned those 10 slaves to find out what they had done with the 10 pounds. The first slave says that he has doubled the 10 pounds, and the nobleman is more than pleased, and he calls his slave good and trustworthy. And not only that, but the slave is rewarded. He will now oversee and rule 10 towns. Pretty much the slave is released from bondage and transformed into royalty. And the second slave speaks up. It says that he has earned 5 more pounds on top of the 10 the master gave him. And the nobleman is pleased, and not only that, but the second slave is rewarded, and he will oversee and rule 5 towns. Like the previous slave, he is also released from bondage and transformed into royalty. Then the third slave speaks up and gives the nobleman the original 10 pounds and tells his master he has kept those 10 pounds safe the entire time he was gone. Now I wonder what this third slave was thinking, what he was feeling, when he found out that the first 2 slaves increased their original lot, but he had not. Was the third slave still confident in his decision to not do anything with the pounds? Or did he have second doubts about his inactivity? The third slave goes on to explain why he did what he did, by saying that he knew his master was harsh and had high expectations. And if he had lost those 10 pounds he was given, then the master would reprimand him and punish him. And the slave just didn't want to take that risk. But the nobleman just doesn't quite see it that way. While the master acknowledges that yes, he can be harsh, and yes, he does have high standards, he's woefully disturbed that this third slave did absolutely nothing with the 10 pounds. This third slave has nothing else to present him than what he was given in the first place. So the nobleman takes this third slave's money and gives it to the first slave so that he can increase it like he did before. But when the nobleman takes the pounds away from the third slave and gives them to the first, there are some who take offense to this, because the first slave already has 10 pounds. And that first slave surely doesn't need any more money. And really it's not fair for that first slave to have more than others. Sound familiar? Hey, not fair. How many times have we said, that's just not fair? But the nobleman continues because he's making a very distinctive point that he wants them to comprehend, and it's this. The first slave didn't play it easy. He wasn't passive or fearful when he was given the first pounds. Instead, he was proactive and took the leap of faith, knowing that there was an equal chance between increasing the money he had and losing every single bit of it. But the first slave chose to risk it anyway. He chose not to live into the fear of the bad that could happen. And according to this nobleman, that kind of bold behavior should be rewarded. While on the surface, this parable might seem pretty easy to figure out, it's not. There's more to it than meets the eye, which is pretty much true of any parable, because parables are stories within stories that have twists, unexpected twists that you wouldn't expect. But this parable about the pounds is so much more than about money. So you money people, you business people, this parable isn't saying to tell your clients to invest their money and resources in high-risk opportunities, although there is a benefit to that. But this parable is not simply about money. This parable tells and urges us to give of our whole selves to God. And it also identifies what it means to be a disciple. This parable seeks to encourage us to use our God-given gifts and talents, essentially our whole selves, and all that we have, and all that we are, for the benefit of God and God's people.